Okay, everybody, here's my super exciting YouTube video. So this is going to be a two-part video on introducing the introduction to race and ethnicity. So our plan today, part one, the first video is going to focus on the definition of race and specifically how race is different than ethnicity. The second video is going to focus on this idea of race as a social construct, very similar to what we've been talking about in terms of gender, sexual orientation, ability. You need to watch both of these videos before you do check-in number 6 on that's due on Wednesday, April 19th. So make sure you check both of these out and do a short activity before you do the check-in on Canvas. Okay, so part one, we're going to talk about what is race and how is that different than ethnicity. And this graphic kind of gives you an introduction, right? When we're talking about race, we tend to talk about certain physical differences. When we're talking about ethnicity, it's more language, culture, sort of differences in ideas and ideology. All right, so let's start with a quick review. Again, when we're talking about minority groups in general, regardless of its gender, sexual orientation, race, minority groups, subordinate groups whose members have significantly less control or power over their own lives than do the members of a dominant majority group. So again, when we're talking about minorities, we're not talking about numbers, we're talking about power. Right? Subordination of a minority involves more than its inability to rule over society. So it's not just about being in charge. Members of minority groups experience a narrowing of life's opportunities that go beyond any personal shortcomings. So again, when we're talking about lack of access to resources, lack of access to opportunities, not because of something that's wrong with the individual, but because of structural situations in society. And then, of course, members of minority groups do not equally share things which are defined as valuable: power, property, prestige. So just a quick review in terms of what we mean by minority groups. So race, really interesting and extremely slippery concept. So here's our definition, right? Race is a symbolic category based on phenotype or ancestry and constructed according to specific social and historical contexts that is misrecognized as a natural category. It's a really interesting but really confusing definition, so I wanted to unpack that definition. There's three sort of components in there. First, what do we mean by based on phenotype? Phenotype is just a fancy word for physical characteristics, what people look like, right? So that race tends to be connected to things like hair texture, skin color, eye shape, nose shape, right? So race is connected to those physical characteristics that we have deemed important. Race also is constructed according to specific contexts. So while connected to by physical features, what we think of as a racial category very much changes over time based on culture, society, and economics. I wanted to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So if we look at the U.S. Census, for example, there's the form that comes out every 10 years. So this is the most recent form. There's going to be some changes in our 2021. Kind of hard to see, but we have lots of sort of choices here in terms of racial categories, but this has not always been the case, right? If you go way back to 1790, for example, these are the choices, quote, racial categories people had access to. You could be a free white male, free white female, all other free persons included Native Americans, and then slaves. Right? You had 4 categories. By 1870, slavery is illegal, and the government was newly concerned with keeping track of 2 kinds of new people, quote, mulattoes, this sort of catch-all phrase for people with both black and white ancestors, and Indians. So now we had white, black, mulatto, and Indian, Native Americans. Between 1850 and 1870, 6.5 million Europeans had immigrated and 60,000 Chinese, so now we get Chinese and Japanese added to the 1880 census. By 1890, we start getting pretty obsessed with race mixing, so we're trying to figure out what categories do we come up with for these interracial people. So now we've got white, black, which is 3/4 or more, quote, black blood, mulatto, 3/8 to 5/8 black blood, quadroons, 1/4 black blood, octoroons, 1/8 or any trace of black blood. So we started getting into some weeds here. Indian, Chinese, Japanese, right? And then it just, it keeps going on from there. In the next 50 years, the government added and deleted racial categories. There were 10 categories in 1930, including Mexican and Hindu, 11 in 1940, including Hawaiian, part Hawaiian. 1970, they added origin of descent, so that's when you start getting this question about Hispanic, Latino, Spanish, and asked to choose a race. So, oh yeah, there was one more point here. The U.S. once included South American as a category in the origin of descent question, and then people from the South started checking that box, saying they're South American versus what we think of as South American today. So my point here is that when we think about race, while we connect to sort of physical characteristics, it's pretty fluid depending on what's going on culturally, socially, and economically. And this gets to the last point about our definition of race. It's often misrecognized as a natural category, basically challenging what we just said. Race is often thought of as biological and thus natural, right? That there's sort of a black gene, a Latino gene, an Asian gene. And as we'll talk about in class a lot after the break, not true. So how is race different than ethnicity? Because you might have noticed in class I oftentimes say race, ethnicity, and I use them separately, not interchangeably. So as we just talked about, race refers to a person's physical characteristics such as bone structure, skin, hair, right? Examples: brown, white, black skin. And oftentimes what racial category you are shoved into, not always your own choice, is determined by how you look. Ethnicity isn't necessarily based on what you look like. It's more based on cultural factors, including nationality, regional culture, ancestry, right? So examples: German ethnicity, Spanish ethnicity, Han, Chinese. Your ethnicity is determined based on the social and cultural groups you belong to. So here's where it gets interesting. You can have more than one ethnicity, but you are said to have one race, even if it's a mixed race. So this is more sort of culture. This is more sort of physical. So as an example, I wanted to show you a map of different ethnic groups in Iraq, right? So you've got Shia Arabs, Sunni Kurds, others. So these are different ethnic groups. So they're going to have very distinct cultural traditions, different languages, different religious beliefs, right? But if you look at these different ethnic groups, right, Sunnis, Shias, Kurds, physically they all look the same, right? So racially we would probably put them all in the same category because, right, Middle Eastern, but ethnically very, very different, and hence a lot of the conflict that we see in Iraq today. Okay, that's the first video. Go ahead and pause this and then start the second video in order to finish your check-in number 6.